So yeah, hi, and say it's really great to be part of this session today, and lots of interesting thoughts already. My name's Rob Eaton. I'm joined by my colleague Abby. We're from the University of Bath, and we work in the Centre for Learning and Teaching there, down in the southwest of England. So we wanted to put a take on this idea of critical thinking, skills development, and Gen AI today. Thinking about making human learning visible. And there's a QR code there that I hope you can see or scan. And we'd love you, if you want to scan that. And I'll just put in the chat as well the code, so you can click there and go directly as well. So there's a quick Menti question. We'll come back to the answers a little bit later in our presentation. But do scan the code, click on the link in the chat. It's one question, very simple, and we'll come back to those responses. So without further ado, I'm just going to hand over to Abby to kick us off.
Lovely, thanks, Rob. So I think the high numbers of people in this session today evidence the fact that this is an area that we're all very passionate about and very interested in at the moment. And Rob and I just wanted to give you an overview of a project that we're working on at the moment. It's a QAA funded project with Stellenbosch University in South Africa and also Teesside University here in the UK. And I just wanted to reflect really on the kind of initial thought, my own initial thoughts today, this afternoon. And I think one thing we can all agree on is this idea that, you know, Gen AI is here to stay and it's becoming more and more prevalent. I think for us, what's a really important angle here is that not only the prevalence of Gen AI, but the reality that Gen AI is going to become increasingly invisible, whether that's in our day-to-day everyday lives or linked to our teaching and learning, in particular in a higher education context. And that's problematic in a sense for a number of reasons, partly aligned to our current assessment processes, but also in terms of if we think about learning. But I think this also presents some really exciting opportunities. And this gets to the kind of heart of our project then. So what we wanted to do and what we're working on at the moment is looking at this idea of, as Gen AI becomes increasingly invisible, it will be important for the human learning, the human aspect, to become more visible. And that will be in terms of, you know, the choices our students and we as teachers make, in terms of the outputs we produce, our ability to critically think about those outputs. And in a sense, as that intersection becomes more and more blurred, we really wanted to, as I say, focus on this. How do we make human learning really visible, really transparent and really explicit? And actually, critical thinking is fundamental to that. So I'm just going to pass back over to Rob.
Thanks, Abby. So yeah, as Abby's just said, we're really putting the focus on critical thinking as that thing we want to really interrogate as demonstrative of human learning. And I think we'd all recognise, you know, that critical thinking is something that is pervasive across higher education. This event is obviously testament to that. And we see it articulated everywhere in our context. So we see it in our learning outcomes for our courses, the marking criteria that we're using as staff. And even I took this photo yesterday, so I had to include it, even putting it up on campus lampposts, signalling the importance of critical thinking to our staff and students. Maybe bonus points if anyone can identify where that photo was taken in the chat. So critical thinking's everywhere. In our experience at Bath, we've been working on a big curriculum transformation project with staff over the last few years, and we've really noticed how it's relevant, picked up by staff across all disciplines. And I think that's points been made in the talks already. Similarly, we've run a recent survey at Bath with our employers, and we've had a really high response rate to that. And they were asked to think about which skills and attributes they thought would be becoming the most important over the next 5 years. And critical thinking, problem solving was by far the largest one that they picked out in that sense. So Gen AI is becoming a major influence. Critical thinking is a key skill and attribute that we want our students to have, both in their studies, but then also in their future lives. And we talk about keeping human learning visible in the age of generative AI. Critical thinking is going to be central to that. But, and this is kind of where we're trying to explore at the moment, we feel there remains a real lack of clarity, of consistency in what we actually mean when we're talking about critical thinking to each other. And we've observed this when we're working with staff on critical thinking. And it's not that this is necessarily a bad thing, but more that it just reveals the complexity, the nuance behind the term. And that's really significant, I think, to reflect on. So if we're saying critical thinking is important and we want to seek to equip and enable our students to be critical thinkers in their studies and their future lives, I think we really need to take this opportunity to get to grips with what we mean by critical thinking, to interrogate it, to make sense of it, and to have, as Abby said, that transparency and that clarity about it. So on that note, this might be a good opportunity to see what you have said about critical thinking. So I'm going to flip my screen and see if we can bring up the results from the Menti so far. I'm hoping that you'll be able to see the results of that Menti there. So that's fantastic. It's got almost 170 responses so far.
Lovely. Okay, so lots of responses, and in a sense, this again highlights not only the importance of critical thinking, but how central it is to so many of our subject disciplines across the HE sector. But I guess what's becoming quickly apparent from the word cloud in front of us, that obviously that we're seeing some kind of keywords that are coming out there, particularly focusing on things like evaluation, this idea of, you know, asking questions, being analytical. I'm just going to test my eyes here, Rob, to see how much I can scroll in. But what we can also get a sense from here, and I think this is what's really important for our project, is that we were almost flipping this and we were thinking about, from a student and staff perspective, if students are given, you know, dozens of mark schemes, learning outcomes over their time at university, and teachers, to, you know, with the kind of, to the best of our ability, aim to kind of define critical thinking, but we all do it with our own slight, only, you know, a sort of different take on that, that can be potentially quite confusing for students and overwhelming. And what that can also then lead to, as well as that uncertainty, is that students can then be spending a lot of time asking staff, and that puts an additional burden on staff who are already incredibly busy. So what we wanted to do is almost take this kind of word cloud that we've got in front of us and use that really as a starting point as our critical thinking project. Here come the slides again. Thank you, Rob. So I want to just give a really quick snapshot of the project, and we're more than happy to talk about the details of this and update people in the chat, and we'd love to kind of come back and share our findings. But we've got a three-phased approach to this. We've been working across our institutions to look at critical thinking and Gen AI internationally across a whole wide range of subject disciplines. We've been carrying out semi-structured interviews in phase one with our academic colleagues, and really kind of listening and getting a sense with our colleagues about, you know, what does critical thinking mean to them in their discipline, but also, I think more importantly, what are the barriers to critical thinking that their students face? And out of that, what we're hoping to produce, and this is no easy feat, as the people on the project will all agree on, is that we're working towards producing a critical thinking map. And the idea here is that we can give some clarity and some sort of sense of consensus around critical thinking, but without being prescriptive. We recognise that the irony of, if we break it down and it becomes just a list of definitions, then that kills off the authenticity around critical thinking. So in a sense, we're trying to look at the language around critical thinking, have some clarity there, but also work with our colleagues to help them to embed critical thinking in subject disciplines, no matter what those are, and whilst also trying to unpack and help students to overcome some of those barriers. And just to share a couple of those things that have come up have been things like the fact that students arrive quite often with quite dichotomous thinking. Things are quite black and white, quite binary, and that's really scary when you're suddenly thrust into a world where, you know, learning is really messy. It's really exciting, but it's also really challenging. And other issues around students, you know, struggling with information overload. So we're looking at interventions to accompany this map so that we can help break down and scaffold critical thinking in a way that really supports our students. So much more kind of focused activities, perhaps even looking at a specific article, a specific paragraph, or even a specific sentence, so they can really kind of leave that idea of information overload behind and zoom into the fine details. So we're partway through this project. As I say, we're more than happy to update people and keep you in the loop. And we're finding it a really exciting and incredibly valuable space to be in at the moment.
Thanks, Abby. So really just a way of recapping where we've come in this short presentation. We really feel that generative AI, it's visible right now. We're all talking about it. We're all kind of learning and grappling with it. But it's that anticipation that it's increasingly going to become more invisible in our workplaces and in our students' learning and in lives more generally. And keeping that in mind is kind of fundamental to where we're going at the moment. And so this focus on critical thinking, so despite its pervasiveness, it often lacks clarity in the way that we use it and the way that others are using it in our communities and our contexts. So we want to bring that to the surface as a way of thinking about human learning. How do we bring the human? And as I think it was Mary said right at the start, putting the human at the centre of this. And we think that critical thinking is a way that we can do that in an important way.
Got about a minute left, Rob. We're going into the question time, if that's okay.
Perfect. So on that note, we will just wrap up. Here's some questions that we are currently just working with as well. So they may be things that strike you. But yeah, very happy to take questions now or in the Q&A, or people can follow up with us later. Over to you. Thanks, Phil.
No, thank you very much. I can see Laura has her hand up. John, would you be able to allow Laura to unmute herself? And for everyone else, I think we've got some good questions here. So if anyone wants to kind of put their thoughts with these questions here in the chat, I think that's a really good exercise there as well. So yeah.
Hi, it's more of a comment rather than a question. I just thought it was really interesting, the whole thing of you talking about information overload, especially if you think about the fact of students come from all different types of curriculums. I myself work at a campus university, but in Dubai, and lots of students come to university with expectations of they're going to be able to find everything in one like neat little place. And now that we have AI, it's like an additional information source that we have to contend with. And I think the whole process of research, as you mentioned, it can be really overwhelming and it's quite emotional. And I just think it's an additional aspect of it that we need to think about too.
Absolutely. I think we see Gen AI as a tool, and rightly so, but in a sense, the fact that we can generate so many sort of endless streams of data in itself can be problematic. What we wanted to do in this project was really almost to slow down that process of learning, and in a sense, give our learners space to think, as we say, in a much more transparent way about how they're employing those skills. And that might be in terms of getting them to practice these skills in an area that they're really comfortable with. That could be an area in their everyday lives, or like you've just said, in a sense, moving away from, rather than referring them to hundreds of things they could be reading via Gen AI, just to look at a very specific output, or just a specific part of an article, and really do that slow and that sort of deeper learning to make the mechanisms of critical thinking more visible.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Abby, and thank you, Rob. And just before we kind of move on, it'd be great to have you back kind of when you kind of got further along this journey to kind of check in again to see how it's all going. We have one question in the Q&A from Abby and Rob asking the same question, but there's a few other questions in there. So if you'd like to take a look, that would be amazing. So thank you. And just for everyone else, if you do have a question for any of the speakers, please put it in the Q&A, but also you'll find on each of the questions, there's an option to vote for a question that you like. So please feel free to do that and it will upvote any of the questions and we can find those easily there. So thank you, Rob, and thank you, Abby. It was another great talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.